The trap was engineered to be unbreakable. It was a classic binary logic puzzle, an impossible choice between two distinct, conflicting authorities. Now, the religious leaders, they cornered Jesus in the temple courtyard, their hands tight on the stones. They offered him a path where every exit led to immediate self-destruction. If he followed the strict letter of Mosaic law, he would violate Roman law by authorizing an unsanctioned capital execution. If he ignored the law of Moses to appease Rome, he would be committing public heresy, instantly alienating his base. They were certain they had him. They thought they had forced him into a corner. But here's the thing. They made a tactical error. They weren't setting a trap. They were walking into a mirror. This isn't just a story about passive mercy. No, it is a precise, surgical, legal reversal that left a group of elite tacticians silenced, outmaneuvered, and empty-handed. Let's set the scene. It's the Feast of Tabernacles. The air in Jerusalem is thick, not just with the scent of roasted meat and incense, but with the frantic sensory overload of tens of thousands of pilgrims. The temple courtyard is a labyrinth of colonnades, marble, and noise. But the rhythm of the festival? It's shattered. A group of scribes and Pharisees enter, and they are moving with a singular, violent purpose. They are dragging a woman. She is disheveled, forced forward like livestock. To them, she is not a person. She is tactical bait. Now, I need to back up for a second, because you have to understand the stakes. These men were masters of the legal system, and they understood the precise, narrow constraints of the day. Mosaic law, specifically Deuteronomy 22:22, was crystal clear. Adultery was a capital offense. It demanded death. But Judea? Judea was under Roman occupation. The Romans held the jus gladii, the right of the sword. Only the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, had the legal authority to authorize an execution. Local Jewish courts were strictly forbidden from carrying out the death penalty without Roman oversight. This was the squeeze play. If Jesus said, "Stone her," he was inciting vigilante violence against the Roman order. That's open sedition. The Roman guards stationed at the Antonia fortress overlooking the temple, they would have had him arrested before the rocks even landed. But if he said, "Let her go," he was unilaterally overruling the law of Moses. To the religious elites watching, that would be an immediate public confession of heresy. He would be disqualified from his ministry right then and there. Treason or heresy, that was the choice they offered. And then Jesus did something that broke the flow of the entire encounter. He didn't debate. He didn't raise his voice to defend himself or appeal to the crowd. He simply stooped down. He shifted his posture, bending until his frame was just another shadow against the temple floor. He began to write in the dust. In any other setting, this would be an act of disengagement, a dismissal of the argument. But here, in the center of the storm, the silence became heavier than the accusations. He wasn't stalling. Actually, he was employing a teaching technique known to the rabbis of the Second Temple period as Remez. It is the Hebrew word for hint. It was a method where a teacher would drop a subtle breadcrumb of scripture, and the students were expected to do the intellectual work to follow the trail. The silence was a pedagogical test. He was waiting for the connection to land. Think about the timing. The Feast of Tabernacles was the season when priests would march to the pool of Siloam, draw water in a golden pitcher, and pour it onto the altar. It was a ritual prayer for rain, the literal source of life in a parched land. And just days earlier, Jesus had stood in that same courtyard and declared himself to be that living water. Now, as the priests were performing the ritual, Jesus was stooping to write in the dirt. He was performing a visual sermon, pointing directly to Jeremiah 17:13. "Lord, you are the hope of Israel. All who forsake you will be put to shame. Those who turn away from you will be written in the dust." By stooping and writing in the earth, he was acting out a 600-year-old prophecy. He wasn't doodling. He was using their own legal and prophetic tradition to show them that they had already disqualified themselves. He was labeling those who rejected the source of life. The men holding the stones weren't just looking at a teacher. They were suddenly forced to look at their own standing before the law. And the moment the connection hit, the moment they realized they were the ones whose names were effectively being inscribed in the dirt of the temple floor, the stones stopped being weapons. They became burdens. They didn't drop the rocks because they suddenly became compassionate. No, they dropped them because the trap had been sprung on the trappers. One by one, the oldest first, maybe because they had the most to lose, or maybe they had spent the most years observing their own failure to live up to the law they claimed to uphold. They walked away. The air in the courtyard didn't change. The stone walls and the sun-drenched colonnades remained exactly as they were. But the charge, the violent pressure, it just evaporated. When the sound of their retreating sandals faded, the woman stood alone in the center of the square. She was breathing differently now, the frantic, ragged gasps smoothed out. The dust from Jesus' finger was already being scuffed over by the feet of the men who had come to kill her. What happens when a judge, with the power to condemn, chooses instead to let the case dissolve into the earth? The accusers vanish into the crowds of the festival, their legal trap turned into their own public embarrassment. The woman remains. The stones lie abandoned on the pavement, silent artifacts of a verdict that never happened. The law demanded a sentence. The dust demanded a reality check. And in that moment, between the cold requirements of the code and the living presence of the accused, the courtroom simply ceased to exist. The woman was dragged across the limestone, her skin scraping against that brutal, uneven surface of the temple courtyard. It wasn't an arrest. That's the first thing you have to understand. It was a demonstration. To the scribes and the Pharisees, she wasn't a person with a life or a history. She was a tactical asset, a piece of ammunition they intended to fire directly at the man they feared most, a carpenter from Galilee. And honestly, it begs the question, how do men who position themselves as the ultimate guardians of the holy law end up using one of God's own children as a literal chess piece? Now, I need to back up for a second. There is a gaping, massive hole in their accusation, a detail that reveals this entire operation for exactly what it was, a fraud. They claim they caught her in the act, but the man involved? He was completely missing. In the next few minutes, we're going to dissect the anatomy of this smear campaign. And trust me, it's a playbook that hasn't changed much in 2,000 years. The temple wasn't the quiet, pastoral sanctuary we sometimes imagine in Sunday school. It was more like a sprawling, chaotic, noisy, industrial complex of religion. By the 1st century, Herod's massive expansion had turned the Temple Mount into an architectural fortress. It could hold upwards of 200,000 pilgrims during the high holidays. Think about that volume of humanity for a second. It was a total sensory assault. The blinding white glare of limestone under the unrelenting Judean sun. The suffocating heavy scent of burning fat and incense drifting from the altar. And the constant thrumming din of thousands of competing conversations. It was into this claustrophobic, high-pressure environment that the Pharisees carved their path. They didn't walk. They pushed. At the center of their group was the woman. They didn't treat her with the gravity of a legal matter. They handled her like cargo. They didn't want a private trial. They wanted a public spectacle. This was theater. And think about the calculation that goes into dragging a person into a crowd like that. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment burst of righteous anger. This was a stage-managed performance. Why go to such absurd lengths? Well, because the Pharisees were trapped in a vice of their own making. Judea was under Roman occupation. The Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, held the exclusive authority to issue a death sentence, the jus gladii, or the right of the sword. The local Jewish courts had been stripped of this power, which left them looking pretty impotent in the eyes of their own people. The Pharisees needed a way to force Jesus into a corner where, no matter what he said, he would lose. If he ordered the woman to be stoned, he was violating Roman law, essentially inciting an insurrection, and opening himself up for immediate execution by the Romans. But here is the pivot. If he said she should go free, he would be explicitly violating the law of Moses, specifically Deuteronomy 22, verse 22, which demanded the death penalty for adultery. He would be branded a heretic, a fraud, and a teacher who ignored his own scriptures. It was a perfect, cold, logical squeeze. Or at least they thought it was. But they had committed a fatal error in their tactical assessment. They were so blinded by their need to destroy Jesus that they forgot to be consistent. And that is what nobody can explain. See, the Mosaic law they used as their cudgel had strict evidentiary requirements. Capital punishment required at least 2 witnesses to the act itself. And crucially, both the man and the woman had to be brought to judgment. Where was the man? The fact that he was missing isn't just some legal technicality, it is the entire point. If they were the law-abiding guardians they pretended to be, the man would have been standing right next to her, facing the same stones. His absence proves this was never about adultery. It wasn't about moral standards. It wasn't about the sanctity of marriage. It was about a kill shot. They brought a prop, not a case. They were so eager to trap the teacher that they left the most incriminating evidence of their own bias right out in the open. Jesus didn't look up. He didn't rise to the bait of their legal maneuvering, and he didn't acknowledge the woman as a prop. He descended. His posture shifted, his frame becoming a focused shadow against the limestone floor, and he began to write in the dust. To the Pharisees, the movement was cryptic, dismissive, and perhaps infuriatingly slow. But in the context of the feast, a festival specifically anticipating the Messiah's arrival, it was a devastating indictment. He wasn't just stalling. He was signaling that the true judgment had already occurred, and it hadn't happened in a courtroom. It was happening in the dust at his feet. One moment, they were breathless, adrenaline spiking, waiting for the stone to be thrown. The next, the leaders of the mob had to stop, look down, and watch the man they were trying to trap calmly rewrite the terms of the engagement. The trap they had set, that binary choice between Roman execution or Mosaic heresy, collapsed. It collapsed under the weight of their own compromised integrity. And this is the part that remains uncomfortable today. It's the ultimate bait and switch. You have these men, the so-called holy ones, who are supposedly so concerned about keeping the law, but they don't care about the woman, or justice, or the truth. They only care about the power to destroy an enemy. It is a specific kind of hypocrisy, the kind that wears a pious mask while hiding a sharp, jagged dagger. We see this exact pattern in our own time, everywhere, where human life is reduced to fuel for a political fire. When we see someone reduced to a thing, an object, a voter block, a scandal, we are watching a repeat of that day in the courtyard. The woman was just a variable in an equation for the Pharisees. And the man? He simply vanished. He wasn't even mentioned in the record, completely ignored by the very men who claimed to serve the law. This wasn't justice. It was a staged removal of evidence. The woman walked away, but the men who dragged her were left staring at the ground, realizing their trap didn't capture the carpenter. It captured them. We are left with one final, unresolved implication. The law was never the point. The law was just the stone they used to try to break a man they couldn't control. So, the next time you see a conflict like this unfold, look for the person holding the stone. Ask yourself, are they holding it for justice, or are they just looking for a target? The trap was engineered to be airtight. It was a classic binary puzzle, an impossible choice between two conflicting authorities. When the religious leaders finally cornered Jesus in the temple, they offered him a path where every exit seemed to lead to his own self-destruction. Think about it. If he ordered the execution, he violated Roman law. If he freed the woman, he committed public heresy. They were absolutely certain they had him, but they made a fundamental tactical error. See, they weren't just setting a trap. They were walking into a mirror. Jesus didn't debate. He didn't even raise his voice. Instead, he stooped down and began to write in the dust. Was he just stalling? Or was he writing a verdict that silenced a group of elite tacticians? This isn't a story of passive mercy. It's a precise, surgical legal reversal. Now, I want you to picture the setting. The temple in Jerusalem during the Feast of Tabernacles was an industrial complex of faith. Tens of thousands of pilgrims were packed onto the Temple Mount. The sun was relentless, baking the massive limestone slabs until they radiated heat. The air was thick, really thick, with the scent of roasted meat and incense, a total sensory overload of noise and movement. And in the center of this frantic, high-pressure environment, Jesus broke the rhythm. He didn't rise to the volume of the accusers. He lowered himself. He knelt, his fingers pressing into the gritty, unforgiving surface of the temple floor. So why did they create this binary game? The Pharisees weren't just bringing a woman to Jesus. They were presenting a fork dilemma. The Sanhedrin had been stripped of their authority by Rome to carry out capital punishment. The jus gladii, the right of the sword, was held exclusively by the Roman governor. If Jesus said, "Stone her," he was inciting unauthorized vigilante execution. That is sedition. Roman soldiers watching from the nearby Antonia fortress could have arrested him on the spot. But if he said, "Don't stone her," he was ignoring the law of Moses. Deuteronomy 22:22 was ironclad. Adultery was a capital offense. To dismiss it would be a public, flagrant act of heresy, instantly disqualifying him as a teacher. It was a perfect trap. If he obeyed the law, he broke Roman rule. If he followed Roman rule, he broke the law. They stood there, hands on stones, waiting for him to choose his own destruction. But here's the thing. Jesus ignored the binary choice completely. He didn't engage in the legal debate. He bypassed the entire intellectual structure they had spent so much energy building. They wanted a legal contest. Jesus offered them a verdict. Now, my first instinct was that he was buying time, just checking out of the debate. But that doesn't fit the man. In first-century Jewish teaching, there was a specific method, the Remez, or hint. A teacher wouldn't hand over a spoon-fed answer. Instead, they would provide a breadcrumb, a subtle allusion to Scripture, and the student was expected to do the intellectual legwork to connect the dots. Jesus wasn't stalling. He was forcing the Pharisees to do the math. But here is the catch. A remez only works if you actually know the Scriptures you are supposedly guarding. He wasn't pointing toward any random verse. He was pointing toward a blistering prophetic text from the book of Jeremiah. The connection is chilling. In Jeremiah 17:13, the prophet warns, "Those who turn away from you will be written in the dust." This is the key. Jesus wasn't just doodling. He was acting out a 600-year-old prophetic indictment. By stooping down, he was physically demonstrating that the accusers, in their rejection of the source of life, had effectively placed themselves under that specific ancient judgment. They were not the judges of this woman anymore. They were the ones whose names were being inscribed in the dirt. He turned their own scripture into a mirror. The Pharisees interpreted his silence as a retreat. They saw a man physically lowering himself to the ground and assumed weakness. They were wrong. They were thinking in terms of Roman versus Mosaic law, but he was operating on an entirely different frequency. He was identifying them as the very people the prophet warned about. The silence in that courtyard was the most aggressive sound in Scripture. It was a refusal to participate in their trap. And when that silence settled over the crowd, the legal maneuver collapsed. The Pharisees had expected a debate. They received an audit. The Mosaic law didn't just demand punishment. It required an evidentiary standard that the accusers had failed to meet. They brought the woman, but they left the man behind. By ignoring the requirement that both parties face judgment, the Pharisees proved they were not seeking justice. They were seeking a weapon. When they looked at the floor, they weren't seeing a list of sins. They were seeing their own hypocrisy being publicly acknowledged. The sudden weight of their own compromised integrity made the stones in their hands feel heavy. The court didn't end with a verdict. It ended with an exodus. One by one, starting with the elders, they turned away. They didn't leave because they had repented. They left because they had been unmasked. The dust where he wrote remains a persistent, haunting image. Does that act of writing ever really end? When we hold on to our own stones, eager to cast them at someone else's failures, are we still under that same gaze? The dust on the floor is not just a relic of the first century. It is a record. And it reminds us that when we step into a courtroom to judge others, we are already on trial ourselves. Maybe the question isn't what Jesus wrote, but who he was writing to. And maybe that's the part we're still trying to run from.